Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app, and we'll keep sharing great conversations like the one we had for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, with a bit of a raspy voice. 5 weeks of back-to-back travel, we'll do that. It was my trip to Chicago last week that I think did me in. But as they say in Hollywood, the show must go on. And I've really been looking forward to this conversation. So you know what? We're going to persevere and have some fun. I'm the CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: questions about the use of AI by militaries around the world have been hot topics in both AI and defense for nearly a decade. Today, the US Army announced Project Linchpin to centralize efforts to use AI for a variety of tasks, ranging from self-driving vehicles to predictive maintenance for equipment, identifying targets, and even assisting analysts to decide what projects to fund. There are currently more than 685 AI projects underway within the Department of Defense, of which more than a third originated just within the Army. We should all be concerned that AI could be used to inflict more harm on the battlefield. But you know what? I'm siding with the Army here. I believe AI exercised responsibly could lead to better diplomacy and even more humane ways to mediate disagreements. I hope the future of warfare is less war and the aggressive use of technology, and more the responsible use of technology. I firmly believe it's going to become an alternative to traditional weapons of mass destruction. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes, and we'll be covering that theme in future episodes. But now, shifting to this week's conversation, we've met some brilliant product minds on this show over the years. If you're a longtime listener, you hopefully enjoyed discussions with legends like Phil McKinney, former CTO of HP, and Philippe Cases, founder and CEO of Topio Networks, among others. Today's guest certainly belongs on that Mount Rushmore of lists of product leaders. Rich and I first met when he was starting UserVoice around 2010, and I was at ServiceNow. I love Rich's approach to innovation. He pioneered the idea that listening to customers can be as easy as adding a feedback tab to every web page when all that existed were clunky survey tools. Today, thousands of sites use the widget Rich invented. He's now out to make meetings more productive by helping attendees focus on conversations while an app transcribes them and offers simple buttons to annotate what's going on. It's obvious once you've used Fathom that this is the future of meetings. Rich White is not only a serial innovator, but also a repeat entrepreneur who was raised from a group of exceptional investors over the years and was part of the YC Winter 2021 batch with Fathom. And without further ado, Rich, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you maybe share a little bit more about your background and how you got into the space.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's great to be on. Good to see you again after a few years. So my background, kind of a nutshell is, engineer turned designer turned some hybrid of those two things. I started off my career, actually, I think probably it was not the first thing I did, but I think probably the most impactful thing I did is I actually worked in a company in the first batch of Y Combinator called Kiko, which was kind of a Google Calendar before Google Calendar. And then, as you mentioned, kind of went off to start UserVoice, which was kind of this platform for aggregating customer feedback at scale, and now Fathom. And I think the common thread between actually all three of those is like taking some concepts that kind of exist already in the world, and just making it much more high usability, and focusing a lot on like, how do we bring this to a much larger audience and make it much easier to use? That's kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning. And so, I kind of look at myself as, I sheepishly call myself a technologist because I feel like I know the folks doing the hard sciencey things and the hardcore engineering type algorithm stuff. I kind of sit at a layer of abstraction above that and try to look at understanding what's happening in technology and how can I pull that together to make more of a kind of a beautiful or easy to use user experience that's helping give people more time back in their day.
So as a repeat entrepreneur and an innovator. I know the process involves having a lot of ideas and only some of them are worth pursuing. And like you shared before we started, you were at UserVoice for a long time. What's your process for knowing when you've found an itch that's worth scratching?
Yeah, I think on everything that I've worked on, I've probably worked on 4 different things at this point. It generally is a problem that I had. So it always started from like, here's a problem that I know well personally, because I feel like there's some people that are really good at being able to solve problems for other folks. I feel like my hack is like I solve problems for me that I vet to make sure that those are problems lots of other people have, right? Because then it's like a very easy internal compass to know like whether I'm really on the right track or not. And so I think that's always been, lead from a pain point I know well. I think over time I used to lead with that and just start building product and trying to see if I could solve that problem. And now, like with Fathom, did a lot more early on in terms of like market research and market sizing and making sure like let's really validate that if like we do solve this problem well, there's a really big audience of people that have this problem. And so, I think with UserVoice, it was like I built it, I use it myself. This is cool. I gave it to a few friends and it kind of went from there. With Fathom, it was like built a prototype, interviewed 100 people that were using competing solutions, right? Talked to a bunch of people that like talked to probably equal number of people that weren't using any existing solution. So there was a lot more kind of, I think, market research up front. And I think that's probably the biggest evolution I've had as like an entrepreneur.
So in the venture capital community, there's this term that we bandy about all the time, PMF, or product market fit. And one of the oddities about the term is that everybody asks if you've achieved it and nobody agrees on what it is. What is product market fit in your definition? And where would you say you're at with respect to Fathom having achieved it?
Yeah, I feel like PMF and MVP are the 2 things where like everyone, you're incentivized to be like, oh yeah, this is an MVP, but it's not. It's like a POC, right? Barely works sort of thing. I think I've struggled with the definition of this too. I will lean on the definition that Michael Seibel at Y Combinator basically told me, which is like, you'll know when you have it because you have so many people coming to you that like, so many people are like, the product basically is selling itself. Like you're just overwhelmed with demand for it. Right. And I think that's kind of would be my definition too, where it's like the thing's just kind of getting away from you, frankly, because just it fits the market need so well. And this is a higher bar than I think most people's PMF. Again, my bar for MVP is way higher than most people's MVP too. So I think we're getting pretty close with Fathom, actually. I think, we've got really high. I mean, one of the things we knew early on is we vetted not only was there a large demand, we also vetted like we know how to like get distribution, right? That's kind of the other thing that used to not pay as much attention to. And I think now in this day and age, because there's so many companies, so many like products coming out, you have to have like a working hypothesis from the day one of like, how are we going to get distribution? And we kind of knew that this product would be very kind of naturally viral, word of mouth. You'd bring it into your meeting, you have to explain why you're recording, you could send the recording to folks afterwards and whatnot. And so by those metrics, we're seeing like we have a viral coefficient well over 1, and it actually just increases over the lifespan of the user. And so I still think there's things, I always kind of think there's things we could do to improve distribution. But I think we're pretty close to that kind of PMF bar in my book.
How do you calculate viral coefficient?
Yeah, you basically calculate on like how many users does your existing user refer. And it's interesting because I think historically you looked at viral apps and it was the math was like, well, if you can trick like 1 out of 20 people into like spamming their contact list with a link, and then, more than, you spam out 100 people and more than one of them click the link, great. Every user signs up, generates at least 1 more user type thing, or 5 users. Ours is a little bit different, right? Like it's almost more of annuity where like every month you have a consistent number of meetings. There's a very consistent % chance that any of your attendees will sign for Fathom, blah, blah. But that's how we calculate it.
To the extent you recall, I'd be curious to know at roughly this stage in the development of UserVoice, was that viral coefficient greater than, less than, about the same?
That's a good point. I don't think we ever really calculated it. It was absolutely, that was a big part of the UserVoice story too, as you throw these widgets on people's websites. And it was a little bit different because Fathom is more of a individual use product versus UserVoice was only could be used by a company organization. But, I remember distinctly like, Stack Overflow was an early UserVoice user. And the Stack Overflow site alone drove something like 3,000 other signups from organizations wanting to use. So it certainly had a coefficient well over 1, just by the function. It was like, but it was weird. It was like company virality as opposed to user virality sort of thing.
So we've had a variety of CEOs of venture-backed companies come on this podcast and talk about the future of voice and the future of meetings and the intersection of the two. And all the conversations, not surprisingly, almost always focus on transcription, including, not to mention your competitors, but just one was Krish Ramaneni, who's the CEO of Fireflies. And we had a good discussion about all of the hard technical problems required to solve the transcription problem. Now, when I got to know Fathom, I immediately wanted to have this conversation with you because in true Rich White fashion, you didn't solve the problem that everyone else is solving. This isn't the 11th transcription service for Zoom calls. In fact, you solved the annotation problem. And it was non-obvious to me until I started using the product. And I was like, oh my God, this is it. Talk us through the process and then how you think about transcription versus what annotation means in Fathom.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're absolutely right that everyone was like really focused on like, oh, I want a transcript of this meeting. And I love the jobs to be done framework, and I looked at that. I'm like, what are people using this transcript for? And like, what is it trying to accomplish? And you find that it's kind of a tool to try to accomplish knowledge sharing. Like, I'm trying to tell you what happened on this call. Well, it turns out the transcript is like not the best, best artifact of that, right? There's actually a lot of nuance in how, especially in business language is interesting, right? Where it's like very subtle, right? It's not like over the top. So I used to run the sales team at UserVoice for a bit, and I remember reading all their notes and being like, yeah, but how do they actually say this? If I could just hear the words they're saying. And so, there were two big kind of insights I had going into Fathom. One was actually that transcription was becoming much more commoditized, right? This was also a thing 5 years ago. I think a lot of people focus on it because it was a hard problem. It's increasingly becoming like a solved problem. And there's a lot of different, off the shelf solutions you could use that didn't exist 5 years ago. And then the second thing was like, to me, it's part of the solution. It is not in and of itself a solution. And so transcripts are super valuable, I think, for I just had a call with Dan and I want to go back in and we mentioned, X, right, at some point, right? Or mentioned Acme at some point. Oh, I want to search through the transcript and find that point, right? Right. Like it's a good artifact for the person that was already on the call to help them find the parts they kind of like as a mnemonic, but it's really not that helpful to people that weren't on the call. What we found was far more impactful. We did some prototyping was to actually show you, here's the 30-second clip of the customer like objecting on price, right? Or asking that technical question. And so we use really the transcript just as almost like a table of contents to find the actual audio video clip and then try to that's the currency of which we found people want, right? Like what they want to do is take that 30-minute meeting and distill it down to the 3 minutes that were like really interesting about that meeting. And that's kind of one of the things we found too, is that people generally gave them some tools that made it easy to like highlight the important parts of a customer call, internal meeting. They tend to highlight only like 10 to 20% of the call, which I think kind of naturally makes sense. Why no one wants to rewatch any calls. I don't want to, you don't want to rewatch your sales team's calls. But if you get down to the stuff that matters, stuff that isn't repetitive, isn't the same thing on every call, that's the interesting stuff. And so I think we changed from like, let's give you a transcript of the entire call. Like, yes, we're going to do that. But our goal is like, how do I get you to that 10% of the call that's like interesting? And then how do I, take the 5 moments that make up that 10% and route them to the right places? There's a piece of product feedback that needs to get to the right Slack channel. Oh, there was like a competitor mention that needs to go into a list of all the competitor mentions from this week. Oh, there was like this training moment, And so I think about this much more as like a routing tool, right? Much more than a transcription tool.
Starting with syncing with a CRM tool. Like when you think about it in terms of jobs that need to get done, like how much more obvious could it be than click a button and have it sync with?
Yeah, original version didn't have that. And we found that like it was good, but like the adoption wasn't exactly the retention wasn't where we wanted it to be. And at some point we were scratching our heads like salespeople should be loving this more than they are. And then we realized, wait, their job isn't done until the meeting is logged in the CRM. And so if I get you all the way to like, you've got the automated meeting notes, we got you to the 2-yard line. But if I don't help you put it in the end zone, it's almost like the job wasn't done, right? So you still have to do the work. And so it's a classic case of like the difference between being like 95% like job done and 100% is like a 10x difference in like the actual stickiness of the product sort of thing. So yeah, we started thinking much more about individual users and like, what are they doing? What is their pre, during, and post meeting workflow? And how do we basically use AI or use automation to like make that way easier so that they can just get back to work, sort of thing.
You and I remember a time, maybe only call it a decade ago, when transcription was a really hard technical problem.
Yeah.
And the benchmark was like Nuance, which is now Microsoft, at like 80% accuracy, which might sound okay until you realize that 20 words out of every 100 were wrong. And for transcribing a conversation, it's unusable. And now with some advances from a lot of the big 5 tech companies, Microsoft and others, the transcription accuracy is through the roof. But it's still the case that to build a technology like what you've done at Fathom, don't trivialize it. It's still a hard problem. Talk about what are the hardest problems that you and the team have solved in and around transcription?
Frankly, our hardest problems are around orchestration. In some ways, I look at us as a systems integrator, right? Like, we're not coming up with new transcription algorithms. We're not coming up with new AI algorithms for summarization. We're not, what we're doing is actually with there's a couple of big components to this. We're pulling together transcription. We're pulling together audio, video recording and storage. We're pulling together AI summarization. We're pulling it, we're doing all this in real time too. That was another big insight we had, is like, a lot of these tools give you the transcript 30 minutes after the call, but you do your post-call, action items 10 seconds after the call, right? In a lot of cases. And so we had to build out this whole infrastructure so that it would record in real time, transcribe in real time, annotate in real time, right? No one wants to come back to after the meeting and like annotate. No one wants to come back 30 minutes later. So a lot of what we've done that's been really hard is just making sure all this stuff works and works in real time. We got to send like a little bot to your meeting to record it. Well, it takes like 3 minutes to spin up a bot, right? To spin up an instance. So we have to have a predictive algorithm to know how many bots we're going to need at 10 a.m. when everyone starts doing their meetings. And so I would actually say, rather than each one of these areas, like AI summarization, transcription, real-time recording, bot provisioning, each one of these is like a medium problem, like a medium engineering challenge. And then you bring them all together and they have to work in almost a real-time system, right? And I always tell our team, like, you're working on like a real-time system. It's, one step behind like avionics, because if it doesn't work twice, the user's gone, right? Like it's not like a traditional SaaS business where it can be down occasionally. If you hire this product to like basically be your assistant in all these meetings, it has to be, X9's reliability sort of thing. And so that's actually been the biggest challenge, is just all of this orchestration of getting all these parts in to work in sync very well. And so that's why I think we kind of, in each of these components, we actually work with a lot of different third-party vendors, open source things. And a lot of our challenges, testing different transcription algorithms, models, vendors, right? Testing different summarization models. And we exist at the highest point of the OSI layer, right? We're really at the application stack, and just really pulling all this stuff together to make a good experience for the users.
Are you storing data from the conversations? I would assume you would be, because you can certainly improve your quality, your accuracy.
Audio, video, everything we can.
And assuming so, what's your approach to observing the confidentiality and the privacy of the user data?
I mean, that was second only to, like I said, there's only two things that can really sync this, right? Like, one, the product isn't reliable, because I think there's a lot of products from the previous generation where that was the general sense of like, it's not really reliable. Same could be said for a lot of these AI things, right? There's been a lot of people that make promises. But I think the biggest sin I've seen in quote unquote AI is it's easy to put up a marketing page that promises that like, oh yeah, we can do all this magical stuff for you. And then it really can't, right? It comes out this gobbledygook sort of stuff. And so I think one is we always should make sure we have a high reliable product that meets what we say it can meet, right? And that's why I think there's a lot of tools to try to promise that like completely summarize your entire call and give you like a short distillation of like, here's your 30-minute call and 3 bullets. And I've never seen anyone do that super well. But second only to that concern is the concern around privacy. It's like, first it has to be reliable. It's to do what it says it's going to do. And second of all, people have to feel like they can trust it. And so we did our SOC 2 before we even launched. Like, I have nothing but senior engineers. We focused a lot on like, and I had some experience with this, right? Like UserVoice, we had PII from customers like Microsoft, Yahoo, Adobe, like, wasn't, sometimes I lamented how much that we had to do all these controls because we had all this PII, but I think it served me well for Fathom because now we know, okay, we may be a 2-year-old startup, but we're more mature than startups I know that are 10 years old, right? In terms of how we handle data. And I think that's super important. And of course, you have to find this balance of like, in aggregate, we do sometimes want to use some of these signals to be able to test out new technology, right? Like tonality or sentiment or stuff like that. And so, and we want to be able to use it to test and inform some of what we're doing around summarization. So there is this balance, but I think, first and foremost, it has to be something people can trust. And so we put a lot of safeguards in place where, cool, we can guarantee you that like your data is in a lockbox, you're the owner of it. You can delete it anytime, you can redact any part of it anytime, yada, yada, yada.
It's the best answer I've heard in terms of how to be responsible with other people's data. But still, there are corner cases. I mean, obviously, these conversations have, besides PII, information that's SEC sensitive. You're talking about stock prices or earnings or various things. You're talking about financial transactions, HIPAA, healthcare related things, PCI compliance. If you're talking about credit card transactions, birth dates, everything is really sensitive. So as you're extracting and learning from the data in these conversations, do you have a technique for parsing out or redacting information that you want to make sure models don't get trained on?
In a lot of cases, most of the models we're using are trained today, at least not on our own data. So that solves part of that problem, right? Is then we don't have that liability surface, right? And kind of firewall that off. But yeah, I think we're getting close to that, where that's getting close to the point where we have enough data ourselves that will no longer be the case, and we'll have to, honestly, that's a challenge we'll have to tackle at that point. Is right, making sure we redact these things out so some AI doesn't hallucinate and give someone else, someone's social security number, sort of thing. I think that's a serious concern. But yeah, I think the other thing we've done is just like, again, I think we also try to give users a ton of control. Right. We built in like, okay, you can pause the recording anytime. You can end the recording at any time. You can, like I said, redact it after the call. Like, I think part of this is like people just really want, especially when you're doing something like this, they want a lot of control. And all parties should have that control, right? Like anyone in the meeting should be like, oh, actually, I shouldn't have said that to Dan, right? On this call, I'd like to redact it, sort of thing. And so I think for everyone to feel comfortable with recording, and actually this is also one interesting thing is people actually in general are pretty okay with recording. There are certain areas like talking to your lawyers or something like that where people are less comfortable with it, but we have obviously sales, we have all this customer success, marketing, product managers. We have a lot of investors that use the product for doing calls with founders, and sometimes there's sensitive stuff there. I think in general, again, this is why it's like, I think for the most part, that's becoming very normalized. And I think we're getting to a world where it's kind of like when you call into any call center, right? It's like, this call is being recorded. We just habituated so quickly, right? And so to me, I worry more about that, like make sure we've got all the securities so that there's no, the security risk of some sort of like breach or anything like that. That to me, I think is probably the most paramount thing. And then as we get more AI stuff, it's like figuring out how to do very restrictive training.
So on that topic, one of my soapbox items I talk about frequently on this podcast is I believe every developer who's being exposed to AI, user data, any kind of development around automated decisions should be required to get certified in some way in what it means to exercise AI responsibly. Talk me through your perspective on onboarding new developers whose past roles may never have involved accessing sensitive data or deploying models that may make decisions that have way unintended consequences. Is that something you made a priority?
I think, as much there's a lot of kind of back and forth about like the SOC 2 process, which is becoming a very ubiquitous thing. And, it's one of those things where like there are varying degrees of how rigorous you can be in that process. But I would say just the fact that you do this process creates this, we have all these internal policies. When you start, we have like, you have to, no one loves all that kind of process stuff, but like, you need to read this, you need to sign off on this, you need to agree with this, you need to like, here's all our workflows. And I think it's a culture of security awareness that it creates, right? Where it's like, at least gets to the point where like someone asks the question, like, hey, anytime I'm moving this data around, is it allowed to go to touch the system? Is it allowed to go here? Is it allowed to go there? And I think that is a big difference, because you go to most startups and just kind of like, well, like if I can get it in a spreadsheet, I can throw it wherever I want, right? And it's like, well, no, we actually aren't allowed to send it to that third party or this third party or whatnot. And so I think that's, again, it's a cultural thing where you just keep highlighting these facts and right, like from day one about, hey, this is again, going back to when I onboard someone, it's like, hey, remember only two things are going to screw this up, right? System falls over, people can't trust the system. And so building features is great. Building, great onboarding is important, but let's not forget 1 and 2, because that's the biggest risk to any business at this point, I think.
So Fathom falls about as squarely as possible into the two key topics that we discuss on this show, AI and the intersection of AI and the future of work. Talk us through your vision. Where does Fathom sit, or even beyond Fathom? What is the future of work to you, and how does that relate to what you're developing at Fathom?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started Fathom because actually before the pandemic was on a ton of Zoom calls with customers and was like super frustrated with like trying to take notes and talk to people at the same time. And, I also struggle with in-person meetings where I would I meet with people in person and I don't want to be rude and take a bunch of notes. So I do a voice memo afterwards. I'm constantly looking for how do I, so much good stuff comes out of a meeting. How do I make sure I capture it all and get to the right places? And so I actually think our vision here is how do I make actually a remote meeting better than an in-person meeting? Right? We started with, okay, well, we're going to take this note-taking overhead off you, right? Because we're going to give you this way to annotate in the meeting. We'll give you the recording. We'll give you all these tools. So you don't have to worry about oh crap, Dan said something really smart and I missed it. Let's take that away. But now we've kind of started expanding our charter, just anything in that workflow or world, right? Helping you with pre-call prep. So a couple minutes before I get on a meeting, it pops up a thing and says, here's the last call you were on with Dan, and here's the open op for Dan, and here's, as a reminder, Dan works here, and da-da-da. As I mentioned, post-call, let's automatically get this in your CRM. During the call, we thought about how do we help you know whether you're doing well on the call? And so we've got the beginnings of some real-time coaching tools. So probably if I was using Fathom right now, I'd give this a little warning, tell me you're monologuing, right? You've been talking straight for 2 minutes, right? Ask you questions sort of thing. In the future, we want to get it to you're talking too fast. And in, the not too distant future, I also look at things where, one of the things that is still, I think, a better experience in person is, if I'm screen sharing you something, I can still in person, I can look you in the eye and tell that oh, you're engaged in this or not, right? It's hard to do it when you become this little postage stamp in the side of my screen. So, but I can see a world where we use, that's why we record the video. We can use eye tracking and expressions and stuff like this to be able to say, you're doing this while you're doing this great demo. You should be aware that Dan doesn't seem like he's as engaged as he was 3 minutes ago. So again, you may want to ask a question or whatnot. So I just look at all these different ways we can put you as a human in this cockpit that gives you kind of all the AI is there to support you. And that's where I think AI is best, where it's at least today is as, human assist, as opposed to trying to again, this is where I think it's asking the AI to tell you what's important about the meeting. It often gets it wrong, but asking it in specific to take on specific jobs for you in the meeting that it can do, tell you you're talking too fast or talking too much or blah, blah. That's great. And so I think that's actually the fun part of this business is figuring out, okay, what can we offload to the AI? What's software better equipped to do than the human, and what's the human better equipped to do? And let's get the human focus on the things that the human's really good at.
Rich, the time's flown by, but I got to get you off the hot seat, but not let you go without answering one last question for me. You've been on this entrepreneurial journey for well over a decade, and UserVoice is very successful and going strong, and you graduated. Now you're pursuing Fathom. Describe your leadership style, and then more important, what has your entrepreneurial journey taught you about yourself?
Yeah, I think, I ran UserVoice for 12 years, and Fathom is kind of reminding me how much I love the 0 to 1 phase. I love getting there and pushing pixels and talking to users and figuring out that kind of first version or two. And so, there's a lot, every phase of companies, there's different challenges, right? But I've been reinvigorated by reconnecting with this kind of 0 to 1 challenges that I really like a lot. And from a leadership perspective, gosh, I don't know. I think I tend to I look at myself as a quartermaster. And if you weren't a Boy Scout, I was quartermaster is the person that's in charge of making sure, when you go into camp, you've got all the right supplies. And so I look at myself as I am part of logistics. I am here to supply things. I supply context, make sure everyone knows all, like you as a CEO have this kind of overarching view of everything that's happening. Everyone else has like this localized view. And my job, first and foremost, is make sure everyone has as much field of view as I do, as humanly possible. People just do better work and are more excited when they understand the big picture. I provide context. I try to make sure we have, resources, capital, talent, and just try to make sure everyone's working on things they like working on. So I really just approach every day of like just thinking about everyone on my team. How can I help? Is there anything I can take off their plate? Is there anything I can help, whether I do it or I tell them, hey, we don't need to do this. Like I am there to basically make sure everyone has the supplies they need to go, kick ass today. And that's a kind of a fun role, right? That's at least how I interpret it. Providing context, providing direction, and then providing resources.
I think every leader knows to say those, and they often come across as platitudes, but I know from working with you, that's actually the way you manage your team, and I know where your passions are, and so I appreciate hearing that from you, because I know you live those values.
Thank you.
Well, Rich, we're out of time. Tell our audience where they can learn more about you and the work you're doing at Fathom.
Sure. Yeah, we are Fathom.video. Again, so I don't think I mentioned this, but completely free app for individual use. We have this team edition. We'll try to sell to your manager, but you can use it completely for free. You'll find me on LinkedIn. Richard White. You'll see this little blue avatar. Everyone thinks it's an NFT. It's just an avatar. But that's me. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn, and I will hopefully find your message through all the recruiter spam that I get and get back to you very quickly.
Rich, this has been an absolute pleasure. After all these years, nice to reconnect, and congrats on all the success.
Thank you. You as well. Really appreciate you having me on.
You bet. Well, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin, and we are back next week with another fascinating guest.